Excuse me. First, I'd like to say thank you to Jeff and the NHC for organizing and hosting this conference, and also to Francis and Dick for their wonderful seminars a few years ago. The title of my talk is The Future of Literary Studies, Will We Know It When We See It? And by the future, I don't mean the future as referring to a content, but the future as referring to a shape. So my remarks today are made in the spirit of the NHC. They are intended to initiate a conversation about the future of literary studies specifically, but of course they could easily pertain to the humanities in general. So in true postmodern fashion, I'll do my best to be both heterogeneous and non-prescriptive. From our perspective today, it's easy to see certain problems in and for the humanities looming on the horizon. We discussed many yesterday in our excellent sessions. There are and will be practical problems in literary studies. For instance, can literary studies majors convert their skills and knowledge into non-academic careers? For those wishing to pursue literary studies as a career, will there be any jobs or enough jobs in the future to justify sending our most talented students onto graduate programs? These are pressing and concrete issues. But in addition to all of this, however, is the continuing more abstract problem of defining what literary studies is today, or will or might be in the next decade. So I'll return to my title, The Future of Literary Studies, Will We Know It When We See It? I will begin with a passage from Jacques Derrida's text, This Strange Institution Called Literature, in Acts of Literature. What is literature, Derrida writes, or asks? Literature as historical institution with its conventions, rules, etc., but also this institution of fiction, which gives in principle the power to say everything, to break free of the rules, to displace them, and thereby to institute, to invent, and even to suspect the traditional difference between nature and institution, nature and conventional law, nature and history. What I would like to address here, in Derrida's quote, is a tension in literary studies between the historical institution that is literature and the institution of fiction that also is literature. In the case of the former, we have conventions and rules, a tradition, as Derrida points out. In the latter, we have something quite different, a principle. It is, as Derrida says, the principle that authorizes literature or writing the power to say everything, to break free of the rules, to displace them, and thereby to institute and to invent or even suspect the traditional differences. If literature were just the former, a dictatorship of conventions and tradition, we could, with a swaggering confidence, plot its course over the next decade. We could, in effect, write an itinerary for the discipline, and I'll add the humanities as well. However, when we include the latter understanding of literature, literature is volatile and democratic, with the power or even right to say everything, to break free of rules, to displace them. The future then becomes anyone's guess. That is, the content of the future becomes anyone's guess. And so just so there isn't any confusion, I do not think that we can escape this duality, but to be honest, I really like the idea of literature as a place in which rules can be broken, displaced, and defied. This also could be seen in Leotardian terms, a postmodern space in which we understand that literature is literature like art is art before it finds its rules. Why do I like this conflict of institutions? I like it because the alternative, as I see it, would be rather boring. Let's return to one of the many moments when the future of literary studies was in serious question, the theory decades. Even though literary theory or post-structuralist literary theory had more or less displaced traditional forms of inquiry by the early 1980s, there were still tensions in the field with a number of high-profile resistors. One in particular was Renee Wellick. Wellick, as many of you know, was a remarkable scholar. His expertise seemingly covered the entire Western literary canon. He, along with Austin Warren, wrote Theory of Literature in 1942. If there were a scholar who could have seen or glimpsed the importance of the institution of fiction, as Derrida describes it, it would have been Wellick. The fact is he didn't. He missed the future of literature in this sense. In his essay entitled The New Nihilism in Literary Studies, Wellick fashioned a condemnation of what he called deconstructionism. I don't have time to explicate the entire essay, but let me point out one problem Wellick has with deconstructionism, as he calls it. The problem is that it took literature or literary studies off its institutional trajectory. It promised to destroy literature's future as he saw it. Literary studies with deconstruction broke with the conventions and rules that were so sacred to Wellick, giving us, as he viewed it, a new nihilism. In short, Wellick failed to see the constructive possibilities of deconstruction's negativism, as he described it. If we, as Wellick did in 1990, foreclose on the institution of fiction with all its possibilities, troubling and encouraging, we will end up with a missed future of literary studies. In his final remark condemning the effects of deconstruction, Wellick writes, "Literary studies would become a specialty, a new anti-aesthetic ivory tower that would deprive literature of its human and social meaning as a representation of reality, as stimulation, admonition, and simple enjoyment." Wellick goes on to say, to condemn deconstruction in the terms that he also noted that deconstruction doesn't allow us to identify what he called trash as opposed to literature. He also goes on to say that is, deconstruction would scare off students who cannot possibly see why they should devote their lives to such negative and finally futile pursuits of dismantling, deconstructing. Of course, one could argue that the opposite happened. Deconstructionism, to use Wellick's terminology, actually grew literary studies. How many articles, monographs, edited volumes, dissertations, courses, conferences, and student papers were made possible by Derridian and Demonian deconstruction? What would literary studies look like today if there were no deconstruction to contribute to the critiques of colonialism and patriarchy, as just two examples? What about deconstruction's influence on the arts, film, and architecture? The lesson here, I believe, is that the historical institution of literature easily can preempt the institution of fiction. This seems to be an obvious conclusion, but I'll further point out that in the case of deconstruction, it was Renee Wellick, a theorist before we had theorists, a very learned man who dismissed the future of literature. So if Wellick could miss it, how susceptible are we to not seeing the future of literary studies too? So now, to be fair, I'm thinking who would be an example of someone who did see the conflict? And this is where I sort of take some risk. There have been many, but one scholar in particular comes to mind, and that person is Jonathan Culler. And so just one brief example. In one of his early books, Flaubert, The Uses of Uncertainty, first published in the early 1970s, Professor Culler foresees the significance of a post-structuralist literary theory. In the conclusion, and it's actually the introduction which is the better example, but in the conclusion he writes, when faced with a text, one attempts to organize and understand it, and the distinctive qualities of the text will result from the ways in which it conditions, facilitates, and, this is my sort of emphasis, and undermines this activity. In other words, reading is engaging in the contest between two institutions of literary studies. And so obviously with the author present, I can only hope that I have captured this somewhat accurately. So I give these two instances to show that the future of literary studies is never totally hidden, nor totally disclosed, which is the problem I've tried to demonstrate in my title. So moving toward a conclusion in which I will describe my dream for the next decade, as I was asked to do, there are two futures to contend with in literary studies. The first is the historical institutional future, the one that can be plotted more or less, the one that we can see and perhaps predict. The second is the institution of fiction, the one that cannot be confidently plotted, the one that we cannot see in its entirety. So let me be sort of self-indulgent and end on two autobiographical notes. And this speaks to the whole notion of the materiality of one's conditions in teaching. For the past 2 weeks, I've been teaching Voltaire's Candide and also serving on a college-wide outcomes assessment committee, which has positioned me as the one in the room who is to justify literature, philosophy, and religion's place as a required course in the gen ed curriculum. Not an easy task. The nursing program, the business program, and the education program are questioning the value of 6 hours of liberal arts for their overworked students, which honestly is understandable given the 130-something credit hours they need to graduate. So as I've been doing this, it's also been enlightening to discuss Dr. Pangloss's notion that noses evolved to hold spectacles and legs to wear pants, and the Bay of Lisbon formed so that Jacques the Anabaptist can drown, alongside the institutional process of forming clear, quantifiable assessment conclusions that can be supported by a yet future to be conducted assessment analysis. And those of you who are familiar with Dr. Pangloss will appreciate the irony of this. I don't know what the future of literary studies will look like exactly, but I do know that it will have, as Derrida says, the power to divide the conventions, rules of the historical institution of literature, and also, to some extent, assessment. It will, I hope, defy quantification, too. This will involve much more than introducing new literary forms, topics, and styles. It will reach into our ability to conceptualize literary studies itself. Now, and I apologize again for my second self-indulgent moment, next year, this is, I think, a more hopeful example. Next year, I'll be working with colleagues to organize an exhibit of science fiction movie memorabilia. And in the process of preparing for this, I went to visit the campus art gallery. And as we were discussing the different objects that we were thinking of including, my host assured me that we could move partitions, we could rearrange tables, we could add tables, we could get rid of tables, we could put up new partitions, we could adjust lighting, we could add smaller viewing booths, we can include flat screen displays, and we could sync music, and the list goes on and on. In other words, it became clear to me that the gallery space is much like the space of literary studies, or the way literary studies in the future, I hope, turns out to be. That is a plastic space. It will accommodate anything, right, we choose to include, not only the objects, but also the form of presentation of the objects. So my hope or dream for the future of literary studies in the next decade is that whenever we get there, no matter what the content, it will look more like an art gallery with its plasticity of space, and it will look less like a static, well-ordered, statistically consistent depository of texts. Thank you.